Hello and welcome to the Inner Sense channel. Today we are joined by Nicco Reggente, who is co-founder of the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. Not only is Nicco carrying out some very thorough research on experiential states, such as those we may achieve during meditation, but he is also a Vipassana meditation practitioner himself, which no doubt has guided his research. Nicco and his colleagues hoped to use neurofeedback and immersive techniques to help people guide themselves into a more kind of beneficial experiential state to help them with specific disorders. So this is a great ambition for his work, and I'm sure you're going to really enjoy this interview. Please remember to subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more information about how you can improve your well-being and information about inner body awareness, also known as interoception. Thank you very much. So hello, Nicco, and welcome to the Inner Sense channel. It's been a long time us arranging this discussion, but finally we're here, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ian. Quite the pleasure. Thanks for reaching out.
It'd be nice to hear your journey into neuroscience and what led you to co-found the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. We can truncate the journey, the full journey a bit. But I always say, I started out as a philosopher through and through, and started undergrad in philosophy and was particularly taken by philosophy of mind. And I think when philosophy of mind moves from the armchair to the bench or bedside, you used to start studying cognitive neuroscience. So that's effectively what ended me up here. I was working at a lab at NYU and then a lab at UCLA, where I then matriculated into grad school there. And then, yeah, got very interested in neuroimaging. I was at first very interested in memory, particularly for its relation to philosophy of mind, with specific emphasis on personal identity. I was very interested in how, at the time, I was obsessed with Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and the relationship between how you can leverage neuroimaging to detect individual memories. And in that way, I got very interested in neuroimaging, of course. And then very interested in decoding mental states. And in decoding mental states, got very interested in trying to predict response to treatments or outcomes that were unknown to individuals or caregivers. And that led me actually to consciousness, because there was a big problem, still is a huge problem, on classifying disorders of consciousness and how that dictates care. So I applied some machine learning and neuroimaging to data sets to effectively try and predict who's going to recover from a coma, and got very reinterested in consciousness through that route. And it brought me back to some of my philosophy of mind roots. And then from there, did a lot of work as a project officer and early, almost a founder role in the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation, which funds consciousness research, and then started the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies about 5 years ago now, where I currently serve as the research director and principal investigator on most of the projects here. So that's the general arc, very non-traditional. Happy to kind of dive in at different points, because this current position is very much so non-traditional. So happy to dig in there. But
yeah, if we could dig into a couple of those points, that would be nice. But yeah, really interested to hear that sort of origins from philosophy, which can be seen as just a kind of sitting back and musing over the world, and sometimes be accused of being navel gazing. But then you've also got this interest in interventions and being able to predict when different sort of interventions for people with various categories of disorders, which ones will be most appropriate for which people at what time. So yeah, that's nice to see those two worlds coming together. Back the early days then, when you said you were in some different universities and working in the labs, what kind of lab work were you doing then?
oh, back then, I was a research assistant in a lab at the Davachi lab, memory lab at NYU, New York University. And, at that point, I was effectively looking at the different ways in which subliminal exposure to certain cues could prime you and increase your memory for paired associates. So I got, very interested in just memory and neuroimaging in general. So I was just running participants and doing some basic statistics and data analysis. But then I got very interested in Dr. Jesse Rissman's work, who was doing decoding of real world autobiographical memory retrieval by having people wear cameras around their necks that take pictures of real life events, and then you put them in the scanner and show them those events. And then you get neural signatures around the degree to which people strongly recollect that memory, are just kind of familiar with it, or it's actually a memory that's similar and taken from another's camera on the same campus, etc., but not actually from your life, and looking at the neural mechanisms that permit for a disentangling of those types of memory strength effectively.
Mm.
Uh, so that
Was
was,
there
yeah, some of
anything
the early work. Yeah.
anything surprising about that work, about what people report to remember and then what is actually observed in the scans at all?
Um, yeah, I would say not anything terribly surprising on the behavioral side, right? People are generally quite good, and they can rate their mnemonic strength or their memory strength with pretty pretty impressive accuracy about the gradation on the scale from familiarity to recollection, right? The phenomenology associated with recalling a memory.
Mm.
People were quite good at being able to differentiate between them. And then that permitted for a classifier that's trained on neural data to actually meaningfully separate those gradations. So the felt phenomenology around the recall of a memory has a distinct neural correlate, and that was part of our contribution to the corpus there, was to say that these particular patterns of neural activity substantiate familiarity versus recollection, even when being exposed to the same piece of material, and specifically when it's in an autobiographical sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
It was very cool work that again was hyper related. The reason why I drove out to California within like 2 weeks of the offer was because it was just so similar to that obsession that I kind of had at the time with Eternal Sunshine, right? It's like decoding memories in real time readout. It's pretty cool.
And the reason why I contacted you, or what we hope to discuss today, was another piece of research on decoding, and this is your recent paper, which looked at expert Vipassana meditation practitioners, and you were decoding the depth of their medication. So I guess there's some similarities between, or are there some similarities
Mhm.
between what you were doing decoding sort of memory retrieval, autobiographical memory retrieval, and then also decoding depth of meditation and comparing that to self-report? Is it a similar approach to the study?
Yeah, I think it's fair to draw similarities there, right? In both cases, you're um, decoding phenomenology you know, along a single axis, right? In the original case, right, the strength of the memory or what it feels like to recall a memory with high familiarity or strongly recollecting it. Whereas in the other case, it's the dimension of depth in meditation, right? So in this case, it's the felt phenomenology of, oh, how deep is my meditation right now? Um, and that is a little bit more of a fuzzy phenomenology and a gradation as compared to memory. That's a bit more clear and distinct. Um, so
Is
yeah,
that
very very similar, but
is that why
it
you've
required
worked?
more pointers in the meditation, right? Just to be like, okay,
Mm,
well, here's what we mean relative. It's more relative intra a person, right?
hmm
How what a one means to you versus a five may
hmm
not necessarily be the same across individuals in the way that the memory strength would be.
I hope to dive into some of the details of that study, but that was one question I had, was about how did you sort of prompt the Vipassana practitioners to um, distinguish between the different depths? So I guess I imagine an expert practitioner would have some kind of um, felt sense of how deep they are, but to categorize that into different depths when they may not kind of talk about it to other people often. Other practitioners may I can see why there would be some difficulty there. But before we go any further with that,
Okay.
could you just share if you yourself have any meditation practice, either now or
Yeah,
in the
most
past?
certainly. A lot of this is inspired by that. I've been keeping a Vipassana practice since 2011, so about
Mhm.
14 years now. And yeah, a lot of the inspiration for the study came from lived experience, as did some of our most recent exciting findings, which you probably haven't seen yet, but we should definitely talk about at some point because that's going to be a large part of what I'm talking about on this conference tour. Um, but yeah, yeah, no,
So
definitely keep a
since
practice.
2011, so over nearly 15 years then, coming up to 15 years. So have you sort of been on long Vipassana retreats, or is it kind of a more regular short practice that you do?
Yeah, I've never done the 10-day, like, and I particularly do the Goenka style as well. And I've never been on a 10-day retreat. I had one scheduled recently, but then some life events came up and I couldn't make it. But I'm very much so looking forward to it. But I find that consistency is the greatest. So I keep a daily morning practice every morning for between 10 to 20 minutes at the very least. And try to do group sits weekly at the hour length. But yeah, no, never done a retreat. But the daily practice is it's my, I say like find your Sabbath and keep it holy. I do it as if it's holy every morning. Yeah, without fail.
Oh, that takes discipline. Yeah, I have a morning practice. I've well, especially since taking care of a little, and I don't often do it as often as I like to, but I do appreciate the what you're saying about the um, doing it consistently and regularly does bring benefits. Um,
Yeah.
fine. So this study, Decoding the Depth of Meditation, um, we've talked a little bit about the design of it. Well, I guess it was you've got a history of designing this type of study and working with scanning devices and so on. Um, but can we talk a little bit more about the detail of the study? So
Yeah.
you introduced something called spontaneous emergence as a reporting method. And maybe I can understand a little bit more based on what you said about where that came from, because you're a Vipassana practitioner yourself. But
Yeah.
what does the spontaneous emergence reporting method mean, and how does that differ from other probing techniques for studying meditation or other brain phenomena?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with the problem, which is inserted. The problem arises by us effectively wanting to have an EEG time series that's demarcated as a function of depth, right? At each point in the time series of the EEG signal, what's the depth of the practitioner at that point? Now, in order to, create a label like that, it would effectively require getting information and self-report from the participant, right? And so it's a little bit of our own, there's an analog in physics, right, of the observer phenomenon, right? The moment you begin to try and observe something is the same moment that it's not the thing that you were trying to observe, right? So this is very much so the case with felt phenomenology, right? The moment I go to tell you that I'm in a three, right, is the same moment that I'm no longer in the three. Um, so to get around this, we created what we call in the paper a spontaneous emergence reporting, which is our attempt to try and preserve some ecological validity within the study and also permit for an evolving real-time online reporting. So effectively, right, participants were instructed to meditate as they normally would in their practice. These are all expert Vipassana practitioners, many years of practice. And they are instructed to just meditate as normal with one instruction, right? Which is that when they feel as though they've recently surfaced from a previously deeper state, make a series of button presses, between 1 and 5 button presses, to indicate the relative depth of your meditation, the deepest depth of your meditation since your last report. And then that permits for us to kind of go backward in time and say, okay, for this time period, they were in a 4. And then now this time period, they're in a 3, right? And kind of ignoring when they're actually doing the button press because that's when they've come out. So it's like a way of back labeling in time. And we compared this to a more traditional probed reporting method, right? Where roughly in a jittered way, every 4 minutes, we ask them, like, whoa, what's the depth of your meditation since the last time we asked you? Which is obviously very intrusive and disruptive, but is a good way to kind of provide a benchmark of a sampling method. So this spontaneous emergence is a bit more of an ecologically valid experiential sampling method. It actually went on to account for more, it gave us more reports. We got more reports that way,
Hmm.
and it scaled better with outcomes reported post-session. So it accounted for basically all of the measures on the meditation depth index um, questionnaire that's typically given after a meditation session, whereas the probe only accounted for like one subfacet of that questionnaire.
Mm.
So that's how that was introduced, and effectively that resulted in across multiple days for each participant, effectively like 4 hours of data that's rated for each participant as a function of depth.
Wow. So, did you find the practitioners found it easy to get to grips with the pressing the buttons 1 to 5 and
Yeah,
so
we had a whole kind of training beforehand where, we sent them these PowerPoints and videos, and while we're putting on the EEG, which takes a while, they're doing practicing with it and going through a PowerPoint. So
mm,
yeah, they were decently well trained, and they were able to leverage the pointers we gave them. It's like, because the concept of, depth in meditation, and especially having it on a single linear axis, um, might not make sense to many experienced practitioners. However, when you kind of give them pointers and say, okay, well, one would be something more like the mundane foundational aspects of the practice, right? Like, so in an anapanasati, right, beginning to notice that your breath is, cooler on the inhale and a bit warmer on the exhale, right? That's kind of just getting started. Whereas 5, even though you could argue that meditation has no such culminative state. Meditation is the
mm,
act of ebbing and flowing and noticing
mhm,
of the mind wandering, etc. But there are some states that are more culminative, let's say, and that was the pointer there, is to say, something more akin to a non-dual experience, right?
right.
Or a breakdown of subject-object would be something more like a 5. So
Hmm.
between there, right, there's a large space, and it was on them to effectively leverage those anchors to make reports within those anchors appropriately.
Fine. So, this a question that's popped into my mind. I I can't remember from looking at your paper. During the study, did many people reach number 5, having
Yeah,
an
you know
undual
what?
experience?
Like, yeah, a large number of, I think it was something like, yeah, we have to, let's look at the distribution. But yeah, no, yeah, a large number of people did indeed get to a 5. Let's see. So about 26% of the depth ratings in session 1 were a 5, and
Okay.
about 35% of them were a 5 in session 2. So
Oh, I can see that graph now.
really,
I'll share the links to this in the
yeah.
video notes, and it's all color coded. So
Oh,
this
sorry,
is
I said that wrong. Yeah, so it's actually 5% in session 1 and
okay.
10% in session 2. Yeah, I thought
So
that
this
was
is
super.
from Figure A
Yeah,
panel A, is
figure
it? Figure
one,
one, panel A.
panel B would be where I'm getting those percentages
B.
from. Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
great, excellent. Um, so what um, what was the outcome then of your study? So you found that the spontaneous emergence method was superior in terms of kind of this intrusive probing them to say, where are you at now? Where are you at now? Where are you at now? Which I can see would disrupt
Yeah.
someone's ability to, or someone's sort of intention um, to turn their attention inwards, or to focus on their practice. But you
Mhm,
also used different kind of mathematical models, a range of mathematical models to do the decoding, didn't you? And then one of them
mhm.
um, stood out.
Yeah, so I think if you take a quick step back, and you recognize the point of why we're trying to do this, the real point was to ask, can we do this in the first place? Can we decode something that's more subtle like this, where, what's the difference between a three and a four, right? Or a two and a three? Being able to do that, we were very curious because this whole project stands as like a pillar of a much larger project, something that I'm calling the qualia compass, or this way of being able to provide people with tools whereby they can have a save state of sorts. Like if they visited a particular phenomenological state, that they can say, oh, let's record this, and then be able to revisit that state by leveraging personalized multivariate neurofeedback to minimize the distance between their current state and that goal state. So that's a larger effort, right, of what I'm calling the qualia compass. And in this case, we wanted to start with something that has gradations in phenomenology along a single axis and is maximally beneficial and maybe not deleterious to enter too regularly, right? So something like meditation offered a first qualia compass approach. And the first question was like, okay, well, can we even decode gradations of meditation, right? We know that we can tell the difference between meditation and mind wandering in large pools of subjects, but what about at an individual subject? Can we tell the difference between when they've reported a one on day one and a three on day two? So that was the effort here, just to kind of preface it, and then the goal of it, right, was can we do it? And this paper answered yes. And it answered yes by which method, right? And that's why we tried out these different methods, right? We asked, oh, well, if we have EEG, is it better to just do channel-based, scalp recordings? Is it better to do source localization? If so, what kind of source localization? And then is it better to just leverage variance within specific power bands, or is it better to use connectivity within those power bands? And so effectively what we wanted to do was evaluate what gives us the best classification accuracy, and does that classification accuracy change as a function of whether it was this spontaneous emergence-based reporting, or probed reporting, or pooling the two? So that was the intent of the effort here.
Hmm.
And so to answer your question, yes, we were able to successfully decode meditative depth, leveraging a leave one participant out cross-validation approach. Yeah.
Fine. And so you talked about those decoding approaches there, and some of them had different kind of accuracy and effectiveness. Um, what was I'm not familiar with all those methods that you talked about. I'm just trying to find the table now. Table one, where
Hmm.
you've got the um, Loretta and generalized eigenvalue and the deep learning. Which ones of those, for the layperson and for me, what do those different approaches represent? Are they just different mathematical? Are they sort of different statistical approaches to decoding, or how does that work?
Yeah, they're based on different approaches at solving the source localization problem, right?
Okay.
So, source localization problem being that if we have an electrode, right, on the scalp here, and we are observing a time varying signal there, the given that, right, the brain is a whole, like so much going on at once in so many
Hmm.
different places, right? And it's all producing electromagnetic propagation outside the skull. Any one recording at any one place is not just one source of signal, right? It's not like the signal I'm getting here is coming directly from right beneath my skull at that region of the brain. It could
Hmm.
be coming from the source localization problem. It essentially says that the potential number of answers that could create that signal is near infinite, right? Like, you can get a vector like this that's coming from an underlying signal of that vector, or two vectors coming this way
Hmm.
and, converging into one,
Converging.
or hundreds of other ones, converging into that. So there's effectively different ways to try and approach solving that problem, or at least reducing the search space. And these three different approaches are effectively, maximally different in the way in which they're trying to solve that problem. And I think like some of the details there might be beyond the scope of this, but you can
Hmm.
definitely read more in the supplemental material where we kind of dig in a bit more around what each of them are doing differently. But effectively what we found is that the less a priori we were, whereby, we weren't saying like, "Oh, okay, we care about these particular sources in the brain, like the default mode network, like 6 nodes in the default mode network, try and find the signal that's coming from there at these different channels," or we didn't break the brain down into tiny little voxels like you would do in a sort of, and instead just took a deep learning approach that's kind of
Hmm.
a priori notion free. That's actually what ended up resulting in the best classification accuracy. So we're able to distinguish between low depth, so like a 1 and a 2 versus a 4 and a 5, and kind of ignore the threes, when we used a deep learning approach, and looked at either variance or connectivity, effectively gave us the same results there.
Okay, so the spontaneous emergence as the reporting method and the deep learning as the decoding method, together they've given you the best sort of way forward.
Yeah, the pooled gave us effectively the same accuracy as the emergence. In this case, it was the variance, like of the theta, of the different frequency bands that we looked at, that actually gave numerically the highest. But in terms of if you were to run like an AIC or a BIC analysis on comparing the models, they'd probably be effectively equivalent. But the fact that we got more reports from the spontaneous emergence, and that spontaneous emergence went on to account for individual differences in meditation depth reported after the session, made us feel as though it's a far superior method. And the fact that it's not as intrusive, right? It's more
Hmm.
spontaneously emergent. And yeah.
Okay, so without jumping the gun, you said there's some more kind of juicy results you've had recently, or juicy work you're working on, and you've explained now that the purpose of this work is to kind of develop some neurofeedback tools that help people um, work towards or direct themselves towards a certain state or experience, meditation depth experience. Um, how do you, so there are some biofeedback devices available for this sort of thing already. I use a heart math device, which is based on
Okay.
um, heart rate variability, a certain particular pattern of heart rate variability. And I'm aware of a few others. 40 years of Zen, I believe they claim
Mhm.
to be able to kind of do something, from what I understand, similar to what you're achieving. So how do you imagine it will work with
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
you've
So
learned so far?
so the original idea here was almost in line with, traditional neuroscientific approaches, right? Which is effectively just leveraging information above the neck, right? So in this case, it was, can we leverage these EEG signals to decode meditative depth? And then effectively what we've built with this system is a way of allowing you to put on the cap, which we've now been able to do on just a 32 channel system, but put on the cap and then have a real-time readout between 0 and 1 that represents the distance in this deep learning higher dimensional space, that represents the distance between your current state and your goal state. And then that drives changes in a musical composition that we're creating, as well as a virtual environment. So that was the original premise, right? Very above the neck, elitist almost.
Mm.
However, and this is where I think things started to get really exciting, um, is that, so in work with one of our fantastic scientists here, Mihir Nath, who's also a practitioner, um, we both, were thinking about this study, and we thought about the limitations of the study and how they're actually somewhat of a strength in this particular case, right? So in most neuroimaging studies, right, like a neuroimaging 101 study will involve the onset of some type of external exogenous stimuli, right? So, let's look at the early fMRI studies. You're laying in the scanner and something shows up on the screen. It's a face. Okay.
Mhm.
Now a house shows up, then a face, then a house. And you're able to look at the EEG or at the fMRI time series at those times and say, oh, okay, well, here's what your brain looks like on houses. Here's what your brain looks like on faces. Here's how we found the fusiform face area and the parahippocampal place area, right? Like this traditional kind of brain mapping approach based on the time lock between neuroimaging data collection and the onset of external stimuli.
Mhm.
Now, in our case, in this particular study, there are no exogenous stimuli presentation. There are in like another subset of the study that we won't talk about today, where we're looking at like the ways in which there's differential ERPs to oddballs that are presented in background noise. But for what I'm talking about now, we're effectively ignoring those trials and just looking at people sitting in silence, right? So there's a complete absence of any exogenous stimuli, right? Um, However, what Mihir and I thought was that, well, while there may not be exogenous stimuli, there is an endogenous stimuli, right? A host of endogenous stimuli.
Mhm.
And there's one particular one with a very regular, good onset, right? Which is the heartbeat, right?
Yep.
So and fortunately in this data set, we have EEG and ECG collected
Okay.
concurrently. So what we decided to do was look at the R peak in the ECG signal, right? So the heartbeat, um, and use that as our 0 point onset and say, oh, that's the onset of stimulation of as if we just put a face on the screen or just put a house on the screen. But in this case, it's the heartbeat. So now we look at the time series and we say, okay, the heartbeat here. And then you look, up to 400 milliseconds in the future, and you say, well, what does the brain look like on heart? Beat, right? Which almost seems nonsensical at first, right? Like if we were to take my right now, well, my heart rate's kind of high. So if we were to take the 80 trials that we'd get in a minute
Mhm.
right now, and look at the evoked response in basically any EEG channel, right? In the, up to 400 milliseconds after my heartbeat, and we looked at all 80 of those trials and averaged them, the line would probably be pretty flat, right? Because it's effectively seen as noise, right?
Yep.
The heart and the heartbeat is not necessarily driving the ship when it comes to neural activity, right? It's circulating oxygenated blood for ATP, right? All this more physical is reduction. However, what we saw, and this notion of doing this is not something that we invented. It's a burgeoning field of heartbeat evoked potentials is the name, right? So heartbeat evoked potential meaning like, okay, the heartbeat, and then is there an evoked neural response? Is there an evoked potential, right? In the same way that you would do an ERP analysis, except instead of the onset of material exogenously, you're using the onset of an endogenous signal. And so what we saw though, right, is that now we can look at all of the heartbeats from a 1, all of the heartbeats from a 2, 3, 4, and 5, and all of the neural signal in those time ranges as well. And as expected, when you're at a 1 or you're mind wandering, right, you're kind of very flat or low. But then as you start to get into a 2, the amplitude of that evoked response goes a little higher. 3 significantly higher, 4 significantly higher, and 5 very high. So the the evoked response of neural activity following a heartbeat when in a deep state of meditation is maximized.
Okay.
Meaning, in my interpretation,
Uh-huh.
that in a deep meditative state, you are permitting for the heart to exert causal influence on neural activity, right? And in a lot of ways, I think that that is a very important underlying mechanism of what may beget interoceptive sensibility, that can be fostered through a meditation practice, specifically one like
Mhm.
Vipassana, right? Because you're actually permitting for there to be, in the first place, more sensitivity, right? The the brain is now more responsive
Mhm.
to the heart. That can be because you've dialed down the noise a bit, or you've
Yep.
upregulated, from a more predictive processing framework, you've upregulated
Hmm.
these attention to bodily sensations. And even if there's not direct attention on cardiac signals, that kind of comes along for the ride, right? And is able to propagate and influence the system more strongly. So now you're increasing interoceptive sensitivity, which in itself is not necessarily a good thing, right? For some people, if they start feeling their heartbeat, it's like, oh, my
Uh-huh.
heart's beating out of my chest.
It's
I'm going to have a panic attack,
anxious. Yeah.
right? I'm anxious, right? And anxious people are actually a little bit better at being sensitive to their heartbeat, right? Um, However, it's the case that, especially in the case of Vipassana practice, you're intentionally meeting those sensations with equanimity, non-judgmental awareness.
Hmm.
So when the signal presents itself, it's received in an equanimous way, which, in my opinion, is the necessary set of ingredients to foster interoceptive sensibility. And interoceptive sensibility being the probable, if you had to put a common thread to well-being and avoidance of mental disturbances, it would be the promotion of interoceptive sensibility, which may very well be why meditation has such a large breadth of impact on well-being, amelioration of mental disturbances, etc. Um, so anyway,
So
yeah,
sensibility, for the people listening here, can you distinguish between sensibility and sensitivity? Um,
sure. Yeah. I mean, you could kind of, yeah, there's many different ways to look at it, but you could say, sensitivity is like, okay, can you tell it's there or not, right? Could you do a heartbeat detection task or heartbeat discrimination task? Can you tell if it's there or
mhm.
not? And the second is, well, then once you do have that information, how do you interpret it, right?
Uh-huh.
How do you leverage it? How do you respond? And when you
Mm,
respond in ways that are healthy and in accordance with something that's promoting your well-being, then that's a more sensible response than,
mhm.
let's say, a panic response or something that puts you into further danger, would be a less than sensible response.
So the meaning ascribed to the awareness, is it a helpful meaning that
Mhm.
contributes to well-being, or is it unhelpful? So
Yeah, and
yeah.
you can think of that in terms of, perspective taking and empathy also is a
Hmm.
similar analog, right? You can be very good at reading and digesting another's internal state. Now, whether or not you care about it,
Hmm.
right, or want to do something about it is what translates into like
Mm,
empathic concern or sociopathy, right?
mm, mm,
Right, if you want to manipulate it, right? That's
mm.
so, it's in my head there's an analogous relationship there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yes. Yeah, I mean, that's you just unlocked something there that I think had been sort of stirring in my mind for a while. That because if someone is manipulative, it doesn't mean they're insensitive. They might be acutely aware of what's going on, either consciously or
yeah.
just might be just a learned reaction or a pattern that they've learned can be used to hack situations.
Yeah,
Um,
oftentimes are, right? That's like Machiavellianism and the whole dark triad, right? Can emerges oftentimes from pretty solid capacity for perspective taking, right? And forecasting and empathy. It's just it doesn't translate to empathic concern.
Empathic concern, exactly. Um, I can see where your background in philosophy has helped with
Yeah, yeah,
with
I
this
can.
work.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so sorry I interrupted, and
No, no.
you got up to the point of the sensibility, and then so um, you've discovered that during as the meditation depth increases, then it seems as if the brain is permitted to pay more attention to changes in heart, what's going on with the heart,
Yeah,
um,
cardiac events. Yeah.
and then with cardiac events, and then with your the sort of device, which it sounds like you're sort of working towards, it would combine maybe some music stimulation and some VR or some immersive experience to help people kind of move towards a state. So would it be would the is the music to kind of stimulate the mind, and then um, how is there something to kind of amplify the experience of the heart? I know one of my colleagues here at ARU uses VR um, equipment to study interoception, and they amplify the heartbeat and do it either in sync or out of sync with the
Ah,
person.
very cool. I love that. I love that.
It's Jane Aspel, by the way.
Oh,
I don't know
cool.
if you
Yeah,
come
I
across
love
her
that
work.
whole like brand of work. Yeah, very it's this inside out approach
Hmm.
that I think is yeah, crucial. So what we're doing is slightly different, though we'll probably end up borrowing some of those insights as well. And the idea here, and this is something that we just got a grant for as basically a follow on for this work. So it's very much so in its infancy. Um, However, the general idea is that, well, first of all, now we don't need 64 channel EEG, right? It's a far based on this insight around the heartbeat evoked potentials and how strong the results are, we can effectively account for all of the same variance and even more of it with just now one electrode positioned at C3 and one ECG. So instead of 64 channels and all this other stuff, we just need two channels now,
Mm.
right?
Wow.
So far more elegant method, in my opinion, because now all that you have to track is the evoked response amplitude at that particular electrode, and make sure that it's collecting at the same time as the ECG. So the idea then is then to tie that amplitude in an evolving fashion to changes in a virtual environment, which is, at first, and this is all to be done in an adolescent population, actually, because the grant that we applied for is specifically focused on adolescents, which we think is a perfect time and place to insert a more gamified way to upregulate interoceptive sensibility, and especially in young minds be able to
Uh-huh.
help foster interoceptive sensibility could kind of radically change the way that they relate to
Mm.
experience,
Hmm.
right? Which kind of can't be understated. And I don't want to overreach about the impact of what we're doing. However, I do think that that's a very important way to help promote flourishing
Hmm.
almost across a lifespan.
Well,
So
I would agree. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, um,
yeah,
and
a little
he's
bit,
done a
yeah.
lot of work on teenagers and the effect of our digital lives on their mental health and their attention and so on. So it seems like anything that where we could use technology um, to help people make sense of how they feel internally and relate
Yeah.
that to what they're seeing in the outside world would be great.
Yeah, no, I am very attuned to that and appreciate it. And I also I think it's a way of leaning into a limitation, right? If you meet kids and adolescents specifically where they are, right, immersed in technology and screens, right, it can be very reminiscent of I use the Dumbo quote or a quote from Dumbo a lot, right? I don't know if you're familiar, but like the Disney. Dumbo character.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
Because
yep. His
there's
big ears and he flies, doesn't he?
yeah, yeah. So there's that quote in there where it's the very things that hold you down will lift you up, right? So is there a way to meet kids where they are in enmeshed in technology and provide them with gamified tools that, even unbeknownst to them, are upregulating their interoceptive sensibility, right? That's kind of the goal here. So kind of back to the point, right, which is that effectively the amplitude of that evoked response, i.e., a measure of how much your brain is being impacted by your heart, is then tied to changes in the virtual environment that go on to um, provide you with monetary rewards as well, right? So in the virtual environment, the design we have right now is that you're seated at the edge of a cliff, looking out at a valley, and there's fog in the valley, and that fog begins to clear as a function of the increased amplitude, which is kind of tying it to the end phenomenology state of like samadhi vipassana, right, which is seeing clearly, right, seeing things more so as they are. And one of our collaborators likens it to like clearing the fog from your glasses, right, and beginning to see more clearly. So you begin to reveal animals and artifacts under the fog, and those are the things that once you've identified them, they give you we compensate you after the trial additionally. And this is something that's going to be done over the course of a couple months of training, of coming into the lab and doing this feedback. And so that's the virtual environment aspect. But the part that I'm honestly the most excited about is the musical component, right? So that it can also be done eyes closed, right? For more advanced practitioners or in pursuit of this overall qualia compass, right? And the idea there is that we'll effectively have two different soundtracks. One that's more naturally aesthetically pleasing and concordant, and another that's more discordant. And if you've ever DJ'd or had like a CDJ, right, and or any type of crossfade, you basically have both of the tracks playing simultaneously, but you control the fade of how much is coming from the good track versus the bad track, let's say, right? And as your amplitude increases, you get more of the good track. So it's this, classic positive reinforcement, right, in an aesthetic format. But as you're getting more and more into that state, and stay there longer, we then start adding in additional stems to the soundtrack, right? So maybe at first it's just cello, and then we bring in the drums, then we bring in the guitar, then we bring in the flute, right? And so you add these different stems, and it's effectively this way of creating a hyper personalized, dynamic, evolving soundtrack that's very inspired by some video games and, how long you're taking on one boss or enemy and what area you're in and if you're under So it's this dynamic evolving soundtrack that's personal to you, that's has an inherently pleasurable direction to it, to encourage behavior in a particular direction, which is all tied to the amplitude.
So, I guess you've had to consult with some music experts or people who research the
Yeah, I
effects
just put
of
together
music.
a big committee on it actually, of experts from composition side, from actual instrumentation, and then people that have done things like this for video games and other health related endeavors. Yeah, it's really
So is that
exciting.
that dial of dialing up or down the two different qualities of music makes me think about the person's nervous system listening to it as well, the parasympathetic and sympathetic sort of
Exactly.
you're shifting someone in one direction or the other. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. There's a centre in Cambridge near where I live here, centre the Cambridge Institute for Music Therapy. I don't know if you've come
Hmm.
across that. They do a lot of work on using music therapeutically for different conditions, for Alzheimer's or
Hmm.
lots of different things. And I've talked to a
I'll
few of
be sure to
those.
look into it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's um I spoke to one of their researchers a while ago, sort of asking them whether they think there's any archetypal types of sound or music that work for everyone, and how much of it is, could someone have
for the majority of people will respond favorably to a certain type of music, and they'll shift them more into a kind of pleasurable state. Whereas, is there a learned reaction as well to some, how will you know if someone has a maybe if they've had a bad experience with a certain
Mm.
type of sound? I guess that's you can't. That's the
Yes,
same with
that's a
any.
fascinating world. We've been doing a lot of work here at the lab around music listening, but specifically from the angle of the promotion of aesthetic chills, right? So
Mm,
when you get full body goosebumps, right, or frisson, shivers down the spine, in response to a musical intervention. And it's very interesting, right? The profile of people that respond to one song versus another. And the chills response is a very interesting probe and promoter of personality, and well-being even as well. And that could be like a whole nother episode sometime around all of our work, specifically around the therapeutic aspects of chills. And again, it's something that's intervening on the interoceptive nervous system and the peripheral nervous system that's stemming from a predominantly cognitive component, right? Music listening or listening to a poem or speech, and then that then propagates throughout the body as a felt sensation,
mhm.
that's leveraging interoceptive systems, right? Things that are intended for thermoregulation and are maximally important for our survival, um, but are
Yeah.
responding to something purely cognitive. It's very interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
fascinating. I didn't know you were working on that.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
That's probably
spoke.
like the biggest body of work we have out of the institute right now. Yeah.
Have you spoke to John Vervaeke at all about that? He was doing
I've
some
not.
work with emotional goosebumps. He wrote I don't know if it ever got published. Him and his one of his and I think it was an undergraduate at time Hongyu. I've just pulled it up. They were looking at emotional goosebumps, relevance realization, and interoception. And yeah, I can't remember the details of it, but
I haven't, but I believe Felix Scholler, who's been championing this work for the better part of a decade, I'm sure he's interfaced with them, and he's currently now actually our results have just been so striking and consistent and strong and even longitudinal now in so many different populations of being able to ameliorate mental disturbances, deactivate schemas, even very powerful stuff. He's now starting up his own company
oh,
on leveraging this as a digital
mm,
therapeutic, something he calls, the name of the company is Rewire, but he's calling it
mm,
effectively experiential medicine. So I would definitely encourage maybe like circling back and speaking with him about that,
yeah.
because it's really beautiful, inspired work that's elegant and impactful.
Yeah, I'll drop him a line. I'm aware we've come up to nearly an hour. I don't know
Oh
how much
wow,
time you've
that
got
went quick.
left.
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah, I got a little more. Let's do it so we don't cut it short. But we can start winding up. Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, you've been super generous, and I'd love to find out more from Felix about this work on the chills and goosebumps. Um, uh, uh, but let's wind up a little bit then on. You've explained that this is going to be hopefully developed into a piece of kit. It's very simple. Just a one electrode on the head, another ECG. Is it going to be a strap around the chest, or one of the oh no, it would have to be around the chest, wouldn't it, for ECG? Like
Yeah,
a
for an ECG,
like
because you can extrapolate it from the PPG with the temporal precision we need. Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
so we actually, just as a quick aside, which is also related to interceptive things, is like we have another small grant where we're looking at these heartbeat evoked potentials in a very specific setting, which is dark cave retreats. So I don't know if you're familiar enough with people, will just effectively go into a dark cave for, between 3 and 40 days sometimes, and be completely deprived of any visual input for extended periods. And it was a little bit of a fun nightmare to try and figure out how to record EEG and heartbeat evoked potentials from individuals that are going to have to put these devices on in the dark, give them back to charge through like double doors and like this whole thing. So we actually developed like a kind of effectively a prototype for what could eventually be a consumer grade product, which is it works with the Muse headband. So you put the Muse on, and then our amazing engineer slash whatever's better than a jack of all trades. He's just a amazing person. His name's Avery Beddoes. I've been working with him for some time, but he engineered this device that basically is like a band like this, like a hair band, right? That sits over top of the Muse and is easy to put on in position and has a dry electrode that has combs in it to go right onto C3, which is the region we need for the heartbeat evoked potentials, and then also has another lead that you just position right by kind of like by your first rib.
Is that like the
And
Halo? Was it it's got those little rubber dry
so
combs?
it's so it's similar to that, except this is just us with a dry electrode wrapped on a headband that then both the ECG and that one plug into the Muse. He soldered up so they can have like two leads coming in. So now you have two additional auxiliary channels going into the Muse that then streams via Bluetooth out the door to a receiver we have. So that's effectively what we're developing a bit, and it's getting its first field test right now in the dark caves.
Have you done one of those types of experience the dark retreats?
Yeah, so I made a site visit where we're doing this work, which is funded by the by Unlikely Collaborators. So it's an unlikely collaboration between Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies and Sky Cave retreats up in Oregon. And so I went there to do a site visit and kind of plan out all the logistics. And I got to go in even just for an hour, and it was a profoundly beautiful experience. Yeah, I even started having white appear in my periphery, right? As I looked around, I was like, "Oh, did someone turn on the lights? Is it time to get out?" I was like, "Actually, not complete dark." So, I'm very excited. I'm going to actually do one in September for a more prolonged period. So I'm
Ah,
excited to see how that goes. Yeah.
so it's in an actual cave, is it, or is it that they've simulated
Yeah.
a cave?
No, yeah, that
Is
one's
it?
actual caves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I yeah. So people report all kinds of sort of DMT-like experiences after
Yeah, it's
long
very
periods without
striking, some of the
light.
phenomenology.
Mm.
And we're interested in saying, well, to what degree does that upregulate interoceptive processes, right? When you're deprived of your primary sensory modality, which in humans is vision, how does that impact what's left, right? Do you upregulate then interoceptive processing? Are you more sensitive to endogenous bodily sensations?
Hmm.
Do your heartbeat evoked potentials increase, which is effectively our main hypothesis here, is saying just as a function of
Mm.
time spent in the dark, do
I
heartbeat evoked
guess
potentials increase?
blind people could give a clue to that. I mean,
That's a
they are
great,
able
yeah.
to read Braille with their fingertips, whereas most people don't have that
Yeah,
sensitivity.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
That was a big part of the inspiration for the design,
mm, Fab. So
yeah.
enjoy your time in the cave. But you just before we went online or pressed record, then you explained you've got some conferences coming up, and two of those are focused on consciousness. So,
Yeah.
what's your what you're looking forward to most over the next few weeks with those conferences?
Yeah, let's see. Well, the first one's in Australia, where I've never been before, so excited to spend some time there, present the work. On that one, I'm actually giving two presentations, one on this heartbeat evoked potentials the tracking depth of meditation, and another on the chills experience where we recorded it during with EEG and finding that chills actually induce neural complexity that's maximally similar to what you'd see on psychedelics. And the degree of that complexity expressed goes on to account for changes in social moral elevation, pro-sociality, charitable giving. Um, so very interesting, very similar to some psychedelic experiences. So
Mm.
that'll be fun in Australia, and then I head straight from there to Greece in Crete for the Scientific Studies of Consciousness conference, where again I'll present on the heartbeat evoked potentials, and then to Barcelona, where my colleague Mahir will be presenting on the Heartbeat Evoked Potentials Tracking Depth of Meditation. And then there's some consciousness festival in Barcelona happening right after that. So I'll stay there for a couple of days. And those two words together, I don't know exactly what they mean, but I like it. So I'm excited to see what that's about. Yeah.
I'll have to check that out. I won't be able to join, but I'll be interested to see what goes on at the Consciousness Festival.
Yeah. Same.
And where can people find out more about your work? So what's the best place to follow your work?
Yeah, our website has effectively all of our projects, ways to get involved, ways to read our blog, sign up for our mailing list, view all of our social media. We have a lot of social media now, from our great lab manager who's now leaving to go to grad school, Nanette. So yeah, I would say check out our website. I'm sure you can have one in the description, but it's advancedconsciousness.org. And yeah, you can get everything from there. Join our mailing list. We send out updates on all of our findings, and we try to put everything into layperson language so it's rapidly digestible, and everything we do is open source. So you can come and see our papers, our code, our data, whatever you want.
Incredible. Thank you. Just before you go, any tips for people listening to this who want to begin a practice, a Vipassana style practice?
Just sit. Sometimes it really is a matter of just putting it in, and not trying to have too much structure or preconceived notions around it. But sometimes it's just time on cushion, right? Maximize time on cushion. Just sit,
Just sit.
just sit. Yeah. It's like the equanimous just do it from
Just do
Nike.
it from Nike. That's what I
Just
was
sit.
thinking. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
My
sit.
buddy who introduced me to Vipassana has a tattoo that says sit right on his
Sit.
wrist.
Just
Yeah.
sit.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Nicco,
Ian.
and
Yeah, this was a pleasure.
hopefully we can speak again sometime.